I'll just introduce you, Susan.
Okay.
I'm Jane Vossler, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Community Senior Center. We're really happy to have Susan Ouellette return to us. She was here, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, talking about migration from Canada to northern Vermont and northern New York. And at that time, she was still a professor at St. Michael's College. Maybe it was 2 years ago. And she's retired now from that and has taken on an interesting job at the Henry Burden Ironworks. And she's going to tell us about that today. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Okay, so I thought of, if you don't know anything about Henry Burden, and it's unlikely that you do, I thought I would do this in two parts. So first I'm going to tell you about Henry Burden and his family and the ironworks business. And then I'm going to talk about what was left behind and how that has now become a museum and what kinds of challenges we face with that whole process. So I called the talk Challenges in Presenting Gilded Age Success. And I mean that in two different ways. One being the challenge of taking a building like what we have, and I'll give you some pictures and some descriptions of what I'm talking about, but also the fact that Henry Burden's ironworks was a source of enormous wealth to him and his family, but not necessarily for the people who worked for him. And so, on the one hand, the recent interest in the Gilded Age and the opulence of the Gilded Age, I think, has to be tempered by the understanding that lots and lots and lots of ordinary people sacrificed a great deal to make that production and to allow for that success, and they often get forgotten. So I'll tell you a bit about Henry Burden. He came to the United States as a young man. He started in New York, but he ended up in Troy in 1819. He was not poor, and he was not, a sort of immigrant who arrived with nothing. He at least came with a very good education, and he was someone who was very interested and caught up in the American interest and focus on invention, which had really begun to expand in the period that he arrived, and this and is part and parcel of the ethos of the Industrial Revolution. So, in many ways, you could say that Henry Burden was almost an embodiment of the kind of industrial revolution, an industrialist who got caught up and helped to make the revolution happen. So, as I said, he was an inventor, and he was an incredibly prolific inventor. One of the groups of things that we have here at the museum are a whole pile of the patents that he filed with the federal government to protect his inventions. He started out in 1820. He invented and created the plans for, and then manufactured, or at least sold off the manufacturing rights for, the first cultivator used in the United States. By 1825, he had begun working on, if you work with iron, which is what he was working with, he was working out of sort of a glorified blacksmith shop, and making spikes and nails and so on was something that were up to this point being made primarily by hand. And he developed a machine for making spikes, which revolutionized that process, but also began to make him pretty wealthy, generally speaking. In 1833, became incredibly interested in the cross-Atlantic trade, and he began to toy with the idea of creating a steamboat with a shallower draft that could carry a lot of weight. Um, but he was also working with someone here in Troy who had developed bell metal, and it was lighter than the metal that was being produced for these kinds of the steamboat fittings and hulls and all of that. And so he created a design, and he actually sold it to someone in Europe, although the steamboats themselves never got produced. In 1834, he then improved his machine for making spikes into a machine that made offset railroad spikes. Now, the significance of this is that by 1834, while he had been in Europe and he was looking at the design of railroad construction as it was beginning, and he recognized that the railroad gauge and all of the actual construction of the rails really needed a new kind of spike. And so what they were doing in construction was they were taking regular spikes and they were having blacksmiths create an offset head. And so, being Henry and an inventor, he came up with a machine that actually created the offset railroad spikes. And again, that was an important move forward. And then in 1835, he turned his inventing ideas towards the idea of a machine that made horseshoes. And again, up to this point, horseshoes were made each by hand in a blacksmith shop. And suddenly he had created a machine that actually produced a whole horseshoe. And then in a series of patent changes, he created different types of horseshoes, different sizes of horseshoes, and also mule shoes and the kinds of metal reinforcements that horses needed because they were the tractors of the time. And then in 1836, he invented a machine for making hook-headed spikes, something else that the railroads were very interested in and needed in the construction of railroads, I should say. So, armed with all of these various inventions and the creation of these machines, he embarked on his career of being an iron industrialist, and he was very interested in another aspect of the Industrial Revolution. Is a lot of industrialists began to attempt, they weren't all successful, but attempt to vertically integrate their businesses. And what that means is Henry had ownership stakes in iron mines in the Adirondacks and in southern Vermont, and he smelters, and then his iron pigs, which were then pounded into plates and then slitted into wire and then made into nails and spikes and horseshoes and all the rest of it. And he even had part of his business made barrels and that were used to pack the spikes and the nails and the horseshoes and so on away for shipment. So he really was very successful at what he was able to do with these things. Now, this machine right here is a kind of exploded view of his nail and spike maker, and this is a copy of the patent that he filed in Washington for his nail making machine. And then this is a drawing of his horseshoe making machine. You can see the horseshoes kind of coming out there at the bottom. And this particular patent, we just had it restored. It was in terrible shape because when people would visit, no doubt the patent was pulled out and demonstrated. And so there were black fingerprints. It had been folded and refolded multiple times over the 100 years or so that the patent was held in the Burden Ironworks. And we just had it restored. And one of the things that came out of that restoration is the fact that Andrew Jackson, who was president in 1835, actually signed the patent himself. So we have a signed patent, a patent signed by Andrew Jackson. Some of the other patents were also signed, but not necessarily by the president. It just happened that that particular time the president was the person who acknowledged the acceptance of patents. So in 1853, Henry Burden's operation was perched, if you will, on a side hill above what became South Troy. And I want to talk a little bit about why that area was so conducive to his financial success.
Excuse me a minute, Susan. Someone had a question.
Oh,
Kevin,
sure.
that's okay. Kevin, you had a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So in this time period, were the machines primarily powered by steam power or water?
Well, that's
both patents look like they went each way.
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So thank you for introducing the next thing. So the reason why Henry located his horseshoe making and his railroad spike making operations in Troy is because Troy was located at a place where water power was enormously abundant. He located both the big mill and the smaller operations along the Wineskill, which had the capacity to produce something like 1,200 horsepower in water power, and that was an enormous available, powerful kind of driver for most of his machinery. Now, in the early part of his operations, from the 1820s up to the 1860s, most of the operation was in fact water power, and driven by an enormous water wheel that some credit for the actual creation of the Ferris wheel, and because it was so big. But eventually, what happens is steam power also begins to be an important driver for the operations, and so the hillside operations of Henry Burden began to move down to the river's edge. And that's the other really important water connection to his success. He was right on the shore of the Hudson River, and the Hudson was an open waterway that connected with New York City and foreign ports. It was for all intents and purposes, a flat water, navigable and saleable river that, so he had the best of all worlds. He had the water power he needed to produce mechanically everything in his factory, and the water transportation system that connected his factories with both the South and also the West, with the opening of the Erie Canal, as well as the Champlain Canal just to the north of us. So the 1853 operation was very much focused on the horseshoes and the railroad spikes, and was primarily water powered. But if you can, and in this picture, I love this picture because you can really see how the wine skill is winding around and then going over this huge dam, which then provides that water power. And to really boost it as his operations expanded, he went upriver and actually created a series of dams linking small ponds together and creating even more impounded water in order to make his operation even more powerful. So the success of his business was entirely predicated on the perfect position that he was able to acquire and then put to use in his production. And then the Civil War increased exponentially his wealth and his productive power. So he began to locate a lot of his steam powered and also the supporting work of his business on the flat area next to the river. So you have enormous potential here coming to fruition through both his the use of his water wheel. This particular diagram shows the interior of, if you look back, let me go back for a second. If you look at this particular, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if you look at this particular building right here, and then you go forward and you look at this area right here, that's what you're looking at, is that area. And right, this dark colored spot right there is this enormous water wheel that the water is being brought in and then used to operate the power all through these plants and the manufacture of these enormous numbers of horseshoes and mill shoes and so on. And Henry Burden held the contract for all of the horseshoes for the Union Army,
wow.
Horseshoes and mule shoes. And of course, the Civil War was fought in a time when horsepower was still very much the only transportation other than railroads, and the Army was heavily dependent on his horseshoes. So this was this war. If he wasn't incredibly wealthy before this war really transformed his ability and his wealth. This is a picture of the lower works. And there's two things I want to point out in this picture. Well, first of all, I say 1880s expansion to the lower works. The lower works had already begun to develop when Henry was still alive. But when his sons took over, they added to and expanded what was going on. And if you look to the far right of the picture, you see the little building that I'm kind of indicating with my arrow. That is the building that now is the museum. And all of the industrial buildings that you're looking at are now completely gone. So, and this complex, again, was it was incredibly productive, and also integrated in all sorts of ways, not just with water power and steam power, but one of the buildings, it's not really obvious, but it's the roof of the building kind of sticks up right in this area right here. That was a gas holder building. And so they used coal to fire the steam plants, but in the process of using coal, they gasified the coal, they captured the gas, and then that gas was used in piped and used in lighting and heat and also energy as well. So they were using every bit of what they could find in terms of energy in order to produce the shoes. And at the time of the Civil War, they were producing 1 million horseshoes a week. So we're talking lots and
A
lots and
million
lots
horseshoes a
of
week.
production. So that little building that I pointed out to you, this is a drawing of the building. And it is the very first building that was created expressly as a corporation headquarters. And this building was intended as a kind of monument to the Burden's success. It was designed by an important architect who used a lot of the affectations of the day in the building of the in the building. There are carved pediments that were, I learned, carved directly into the brick. The brick itself that the building is constructed of was not just local brick; it was imported glazed brick. The roof was Spanish tile, and then up at the top near the cupola, you can see the glass roof that was incorporated in the building, and that was it was both useful as well as beautiful. So the light would come down through those glass panels, and then it would pass through a ley light that exists about 10 feet below the glass roof, and that ley light was glassed with a particular type of glass that diffused the light, and so the whole interior of the building was lit essentially from the daylight, and the exterior of the building, the main front stairs, which are if you notice the arch over that one set of double doors, that was the main door into the building. And then to the side, the steps up to a smaller door, that was the paymaster's door. And that's where the workers would go and receive their pay on Saturday afternoon. So the workers weren't welcome into the front of the building, nor were they given a whole lot of accolades for their work. They were just simply paid with their pay packets and sent on their way. The building itself survived. It's one of those interesting things that happen. I want to go back a couple of slides because there's something I want to point out to you. Up in the top of this this drawing, there are a couple of houses that you kind of just see through the smoke. These are the mansions of the Burden family, and they haven't survived either. In fact, the only thing that's survived beyond the corporate headquarters building is the Woodside Church, which is over here on the right side of this drawing, which was built by the Burdens. The story goes that Mrs. Burden really wanted the workers to go to church, and so she prevailed on her husband to actually have this church constructed so that they could easily get to the church from worker housing. So, unfortunately, there are not a lot of photographs of the actual people who worked for Henry Burden. It's not a big surprise. Often laborers weren't considered important enough to actually photograph. So this is one of those unusual photographs, and I think it was really intended to capture the productivity of the business, not the people who were doing the work. But you can see in the picture they're loading kegs with horseshoes that are basically being. You can see the bins with the horseshoes in them. Each bin has a particular size or a particular type of horseshoe. The city long heels, for instance, that are towards the left-hand side of the picture, going down through mule shoes and so on. And then the kegs themselves would be loaded onto railroad tracks that were right next to the building and shipped out on railroad cars. This production created enormous wealth. If you can see, basically this graph goes from 1860 to 1884. The purple is the horseshoes, and the yellow is the money that was made from railroad spikes. But the combined value of what was being produced over the course of those years, you can see, topped over $2 million in at least 2 separate years, and approached, over $2.5 million, and approached or surpassed 2 million in many years. And this was a time when there was no such thing as income tax. So the value of all of these horseshoes and railroad spikes flowed into the Burden coffers really very regularly. And they spent the money on building fancy houses and living very elaborate lifestyles. This was Henry Burden's house. You can see it's a very elaborate Italianate, and it no longer exists, so we don't know what it would have looked like in the interior. But as a Gilded Age house, one can only imagine what it would have been like to live in a place like this. And the Burdens obviously were very successful. One of Henry Burden's sons married Cornelius Vanderbilt's daughter, and at the time that they got married, the Burdens' wealth outstripped the Vanderbilt's railroad wealth. So that should give you an idea of just how lucrative all of this really was. But all good things do come to an end. One of the things that declined rapidly after 1920 was the use of horses on American farms, as cars and eventually tractors began to take the place of horses. The need for horseshoes dropped off precipitously. This graph shows you the number of horses on American farms in the period between 1870 and 1950, and you can see that it just basically drops off very precipitously after 1920. And so the horseshoe industry became not as lucrative, and actually was quite moribund after 1930. Railroad construction also dropped off. And so what you have was in the period especially between 1870, when they were working on the Transcontinental Railroad, all the way through to 1970, railroad construction was fairly consistent, but it really began to drop off. And railroad spikes, as the construction of railroads moved west, and Henry Burden didn't produce rails; he only produced spikes, and so he did not, and his sons did not actually benefit from the production of rails. So by 1940, the business was no longer really producing the kind of wealth that it had been in the century before. And the family had all moved away from Troy. They were all living in New York, and with places in Newport, and doing European vacations and all the rest of it, and were no longer really focused on what was happening with the family business. And so in 1940, the decision was made to sell everything here in Troy to Republic Steel. Republic Steel was mostly interested in the ownership that the Burdens still maintained in some of the iron mines in both the southern Adirondacks as well as Vermont. And so that was one of the reasons that they purchased. And then another reason was because at the very end of the productive years, they actually bought a Bessemer steel furnace. And that was another aspect of the Burden Ironworks that Republic Steel was interested in. And so from 1940 to 1971, Republic Steel owned and to a certain extent operated what was left of the Burden Ironworks, although some of it was rapidly disappearing. And unfortunately for our building, they didn't see it as worthy of really of much in the way of care. And in fact, I was told by a former Republic Steel employee that they used it for a place to store spare parts for the steel manufacturing industry. So that brings me to the 1970s. And what was left of the Burden Ironworks, which was mostly ruined buildings, and the beautiful old Victorian just moldering away, surrounded by trees, all of the windows for the most part smashed out. And the place was really in very, very rough shape. And a group of local leaders got together and said, wait a minute, this is an important part of our past and it should be preserved. And so they got together and they created the Hudson Mohawk Industrial Gateway, which was intended, I think, originally to be a kind of umbrella organization under which multiple museums might have operated. Just to the south of us here on the riverbank was the iron company that produced the iron plates for the Monitor. And so there was some idea of taking part of that, the remaining building, and making that into a museum to the Monitor. And then this building would be a museum to the ironworks. And then there are a few other buildings further north of us along Industrial Parkway that had been involved in the extensive bell manufacture in Troy. And so there was this idea that there would be multiple museums devoted to the industrial past of Troy. But the first and most important work that they saw was the saving of this building, which was quickly deteriorating into the ground, and Republic Steel basically abandoned it, and it became the property of the city of Troy, which then sold the building to the organized group that became the Gateway for $1. And the building that they inherited once the tools were removed was stripped down pretty sadly. There had originally been beautiful cherry paneling all around the walls. That was gone. The glass that had been in the lay light, you can see in the ceiling here, the lay light was completely gone. Some of the glass roof was still in place, but a lot of the building was open to the weather. So there was an enormous amount of restoration work that needed to happen just to keep the building from collapsing in and on itself. And the building itself, I'll go back for a second just to point out to you that the original Spanish tile roof was gone, and Republic Steel had replaced it with an asphalt shingle roof, which was failing at the time of the acquisition of the building. This is another view looking to the south of the building, and you can just sort of see what did survive is a beautiful cherry vaulted ceiling, and that really is the evidence that we have of what the paneling would have looked like on the inside of the building before it was taken. The floors were in such bad shape that a good part of the floors, probably about 80% of the floors now, are just plywood because the floor had rotted to the point where it was dangerous to stand on. And that brings me to the modern challenge that we have here. We now have a museum charter. The museum charter establishes us as a museum intended to capture the spirit and the history of the Industrial Revolution, the collections that have begun to coalesce in the building focus on the main industrial pursuits of the Troy area, including bell manufacturing, piano manufacturing, the creation of the GE was just down the road from us, and the creation of both steam engines and steam generators to generate electricity, and of course the older inventions of Henry Burden and the horseshoes and the railroad spikes and so on that were part and parcel of the wealth that built this building. Some work has been done to save the building. The original Spanish tile roof has actually been replaced at huge expense. And we have now managed to restore the plaster, which was in fairly bad condition. And we have not been able to, and probably aren't going to be able to for some time, restore the paneling. But we're really sort of making strides in creating a building that is far more usable. And we're hoping this year we have a huge grant that we're hoping that at least some of that grant money will pay for a modern HVAC system, which will make the building more usable over the year. The building itself has wonderful grounds, and we actually have 2 outdoor exhibits that we have acquired. One is the piece that you see at the top of the picture. That is one of the mechanisms that they used for hauling the smelted, actually the residue of this smelting iron away, and then dumping it where they actually expanded the river, the edge of the riverbed along the river by probably a half a mile, by dumping the slag that was being produced by all these iron making operations along the river. There was more than one. Burden was one of them. There were several others. The building itself has been, the new roof has been put on, and we've done some repairs to some of the other elements of the building. And so we're working hard to really create a presentable museum. But we also are along with the issues of raising money and trying to create an interior that allows us to really sort of present this history, we're also working on trying to draw in the stories of the people who, not only just the people who benefited at the top of the heap, if you will, but also looking at the stories of the people who worked in the various aspects of Burden's operations. And so we've been collecting pictures and oral histories and as much as we can in terms of documentation of the people who would have been working in the museum or I'm sorry, in the Burden Ironworks and displaying them, or at least giving some aspect of their story some place in the museum, so that people can kind of get a full appreciation for everything that that happened here, not just the sort of top of the pyramid, if you will. So we're trying to, as I say here, look with clear eyes at what we present and how we can go about doing that. And of course, the challenges are that people tend to be attracted to. There's a certain population of people that are attracted to the ladle car, for instance, or the steam engine, or that we just located to the exterior property last summer, and the mechanical aspects of Henry Burden's inventions, and that's all well and good. But I think there are other aspects of the world that we're trying to recapture and present that will be equally interesting. They just present us a greater challenge because these were people and places that weren't so well documented. So I want to provide time for people to ask questions, and so I'm going to stop sharing here. There we are. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
That was really interesting, Susan. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Question. I have a question. You mentioned the horseshoes that were created.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea how many railroad spikes were manufactured? I mean,
millions. Absolutely millions. The number of it probably figures in miles and miles and miles of track being laid down, because they lay down tracks, but then they have to be repaired, and railroad spikes have to be used, and so there's a whole host of railroad spikes that were created to first construct railroads, but then also to repair. I think of even the 1927 flood in Vermont and northern New York that took out a bunch of railroad track. Every time there was a disaster, every time there was a new train route that was created, or some repairs to a train route, spikes would have been an integral part of that. So I don't know that anybody has had the ability to count them. I just know that they made millions of them. One of Richard's question about slaves or free blacks, to my knowledge, there were no slaves here, at least at the time that Henry Burden was operating his business. By 1826, slavery was illegal in New York State, but There may well have been escaped slaves or free blacks who were working here. There's almost no evidence of it. We've started to, but there's an enormous pile of documentation around who was working at the various aspects of Burden's Ironworks, and we don't know. I mean, what we're trying to do is identify workers, and then perhaps we might be able to identify the people of color working here. There may well have been Native people working here as well. We just don't know.
How many were employed there at various times?
Well, I've seen employment records for as many as over 1,000 workers at any given time. It depends on where you're, whether it's the lower works or the upper works. And unfortunately, not all of the employment records have survived. But I would venture a guess that at any given time there was probably somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 people who were employed by Burden. I don't know the question about women working. I know that often in nail sorting operations, women were sometimes employed, but I haven't seen evidence of that yet. I'm hoping to find evidence of that, but I haven't seen it. So I can't answer that question. I don't know. I would be surprised that if there weren't women working in some aspect of it, because especially after the Civil War, when immigrants really start to come into Troy, their families would have worked, and certainly children would have been included in that as well. I know that, unfortunately, some of this history has just been disappeared. For instance, not far up the hill where the horseshoe factory was located, there was a cemetery, and locally it's referred to as the horse nail factory cemetery. That's the way it's referred to. In fact, it's gone. Supposedly the bodies were removed, but I've heard from a number of people that they just simply, acquired the property and just didn't remove most of the bodies. I just saw a question pop up and I missed what it was. Was that you, Richard? Did I see Richard Allen?
He asked if the company provided housing for the workers.
There was company housing, but most of the company housing was provided to the sort of upper echelon of management. But there was a lot of tenement housing that stretched along the sort of the edge of where, right next to the railroad tracks and basically right up against where the land started to move up into the higher elevation. And I've seen pictures of some of the worker housing. It's pretty dismal looking. But I suspect it wasn't provided. It was there, and you paid rent. It might have been deducted from your pay, but you definitely would have paid rent. The museum is financed primarily through memberships and grants. We just finished a membership, an annual appeal, and memberships are beginning to come in. It's expensive to operate the building. On average, it probably costs us around $100,000 a year to keep it alive. And so we really do have to, we have two major fundraising events that we do every year. One is the annual appeal for memberships, and another is a gala that we host in the fall. This year it'll be September 28th. And then in between, people do come, and once we're open again, hopefully people will come, and people are generous about. We don't charge for admission; we just ask for donations, and so far we've been able to survive on that. The big the projects like HVAC and the project of restoring the doors and windows and all of that stuff, that's grant supported. We recently were awarded a grant from New York State for some of that work. It's not going to cover all of it, but it's going to cover some of it. In the world of grant writing, we've been fairly successful, but it's never enough. It's really one of those, it's a catch-22 situation. So for instance, the grant that we recently got from New York State sounds like a lot of money. It's $500,000, but by the time we repair the front steps, that's $200,000. And by the time we pay for the HVAC, that's another $150,000. And by the time we repair the doors and windows, we probably will be out of money. And we have to match those funds. So we raised about $200,000 in matching funds to do some of the work. And that's how we paid for the plaster work and the painting and so on that we've been able to do this past year. And we also repaired the Paymaster steps, which were in terrible shape, and repaired the Paymaster door in anticipation of that being our new front door, because the original front doors will be, hopefully, if we have a contractor who's able to come in and do that work this year, they'll be working on it. So that door won't be, it won't be possible to use that door. So we have a different front door, which I'm the person who underwrote the entire cost of that, just was incredibly generous and made it possible. But just repairing those steps and that door was $75,000. So everything is incredibly expensive. And so we do our best to raise the money and pay every penny that we can into what, into our preserving our building. And hopefully once we can create, once we get to the point where everything is stable and useful and so on, we want to be able to use the building as a kind of community resource and sort of pay it forward, if you will, to the community for their support and their treasures that they've poured into here. Jane, you're muted.
You have a list of employees, even though it's not a complete list. So what's the next step in trying to find out more about these workers?
Well, I found that there is a collection of documents, 53 boxes of documents at the local archive in Troy at the Hart-Cluett Museum. And they're not in any order. And I think what happened was whoever had these things just piled them into boxes, gave them to Hart-Cluett, and Hart-Cluett doesn't really have the staff to carefully go through. So that's how we're going to do it. We're just going to, our volunteers, we've already spent some time down there just kind of assessing what's there and trying to kind of make sense of how to go about using materials. And so we're hoping to do internships and kind of get student interest in coming in and working with these materials. But it's going to take years before we really get there. I saw one question about wheelchair accessibility. Yes, we have a ramp. And when the museum is open, the floor itself will be open enough so that wheelchairs can navigate the space. Yes, Janet?
Hi. Great presentation. Good to know that that pocket there is just amazing. This is great. Continuing your Gilded Age, this Sunday down the Hudson in Irvington, New York, the Historical Society, they've been promoting it for weeks, has, I think it's at 2:00, a presentation on the Gilded Age, interesting stories and times, if anybody wants to continue the Gilded. That's Irvington Historical Society.
Irvington. Good to know. One of the things that that I've talked about, we haven't done anything about this yet because I've only been here a year. But the historian, the Rensselaer County historian, Kathy Sheehan, who is an expert on the Gilded Age in Troy, and I are talking about. And she works out of the Hart Cluett Museum, which is one of the Gilded Age brownstones that was in the Gilded Age program that PBS or HBO, I'm sorry, HBO produced. We're talking about doing some programs where we can do sort of like, here's the Gilded Age, sort of like the lifestyle of the rich and famous, and here's the sort of industrial stuff that buoyed up the lifestyle of the rich and famous. And so we're talking about doing some programs like that. So I'd say stay tuned. And then the other thing that happens here in Troy, and it's going to happen in September, is, and a lot of people don't know this, but there are more Tiffany windows per square mile in Troy than any place else on earth. We have some of the most beautiful Tiffany windows existing, and we do a Treasures of Tiffany tour in the fall. We're going to do it in September. So anyone who wants to come to Troy and see the Tiffany windows, that is a wonderful opportunity. There are three churches, one of them a Catholic church, that the entire, not just the windows, but the entire the pews, everything in the interior of the church is Tiffany designed. But the very first set of Tiffany windows that were installed in Troy in St. John's Episcopal Church are just, they're stunning. And so to see these things in place and to see them preserved is really amazing too. So we do a number of those kinds of tours, and hopefully now that we're getting past COVID, we'll be able to do more of that kind of work. That's what I'm hoping. So, did I miss a question? I saw something pop up, and I'm not seeing it. Did I miss somebody's question earlier, or?
There was one, but I don't recall what it was.
Did you catch that, Jane?
It was something about the glass roof. Did it make the interior cold, and had solar power been considered for heating the building?
It does allow for cold air to, or rather cold to come in. It also allows for heat to come in. So one of the things that I was completely blown away by this, but one of our architects has come up with a product that is going to be positioned over the top of the lay light that's translucent and will allow light to come through, but will not allow cold or heat to come through. So it's a really amazing product. It's brand new, and I knew nothing about it, and I was completely blown away by the utility of it. So I think it's going to be really, really cool. The cupola, which you might have noticed in the picture, was used in the summertime. There's a big open grate that gets opened up in the summertime, and the heat of the building goes up through that cupola, and then we close that in the fall to keep the heat inside the building. As far as solar power is concerned, we can't put anything on the building that wasn't here in 1882 when it was built. So solar is not in the picture for us. And we have some nice grounds. We've got about 2 acres of grounds, but we don't have enough space to really do solar. And anytime we put a shovel in the ground, we have to do archaeological work. So there's kind of a catch-22 with that as well. But we're hoping to be able to do some improvements using air source HVAC technology. The new technologies, I think, are going to make a huge difference to the building, and there won't be a lot of penetrations in the building or problems with managing that. So I'm really happy about that. The discovery of the lucite, or rather the revealing by the architects of the lucite panels, I think is going to be a wonderful way of preserving the ley lights utility, but preventing the loss of heat through the glass. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to be able to keep marrying the sort of beauty of the 1882 building with modern technology and making it work, so that we can, keep and the interior of the building, for the most part, it's just a big open space. If you saw it in those pictures, the offices that we use are sort of off to the side. They're actually the offices of the original, the president and vice president of the business, and we've preserved those. Eventually, those will be our library and reading room for the documents and so on that we have accumulated over time. We have a pretty good book collection, pretty good document collection. We're sorting through and inventorying and trying to create a kind of searchable database so that people can see what we have. I mentioned the bell manufacturing in Troy. That's another thing that we have a lot of information about, and some of the bells that were actually manufactured in Troy. So there are lots of fascinating stories. Just to tell you one about the bell manufacturers. So very early on, the Hanks family, located in what is now Albany, but was at the time known as West Troy. And Hanks had worked with Paul Revere in making bells, and he came here and started making bells. And eventually he switched and stopped making bells and started making other things. And one of his apprentices, a man named Meneely, basically took up the business and started to make bells in West Troy. At the time of the Civil War, the Meneely dynasty, if you will, the business had passed to the sons of the original creator of the Meneely Bell Company, and one of the sons volunteered for the Civil War and went off to fight as an officer. He survived the war. Over the course of the years of the war, the other two brothers managed and made the Meneely Bell Company successful, or kept it successful. And so the Meneely brother, the third brother, came back and basically said, "Here I am, Civil War's over, and I want to, come back into the business." And the two brothers were like, "Sorry, we are not interested in incorporating you." And so in a fit of pique, the third brother went across the river into Troy. And the ironic thing is, the profile of the land is such that the West Troy Meneely Bell Company on the west side of the shore of the river, and the Meneely Bell Company of Troy on the east side literally face each other over the river. So the third brother set himself up as competition. First, he was in partnership with this other apprentice of the Menelys, and eventually he renamed his bell company the Old Meneely Bell Company, which created all sorts of legal ramifications and arguments between the brothers and so on. But both of those bell companies survived and produced bells all the way up to 1962, I think, when one bell company went out of business and the other one was bought up by an Ohio bell making company and moved the whole operation west to Ohio. So, literally thousands of bells were produced in Troy. They're all over the world. We've been trying to document them. We have a pretty extensive spreadsheet with the bells that we've identified that were made at either West Troy or Troy, or the Hanks Company or the Jones Company, which was the spinoff of the original Mineola Company as well. And so we get a lot of requests from people who have a bell in their tower, and they say, "Oh, we have a bell and it says Mineola on it, and we want to know all about it." And 9 times out of 10, we have to say to them, "Do you have a picture of the bell? Can you send us any markings on the bell? Do you have any idea of when the bell could have been deployed? Because it could be a West Troy, it could be a Troy, it could be a Hanks, it could be, so, but we help people to identify their bells. Sometimes we can actually even produce the invoice that sold the bell. We have lots of stories about how bells got transported to different places, and they literally went all over the world. So bells in China and Japan and places like that. So it's in Africa, an amazing number of bells went to Africa because there were so many missions that were building churches in Africa through that period. And having a church bell was really important to calling people into worship. So that's another part of the slice of the stories that we hope to tell here, and then along with bell manufacturing and horseshoes and spikes and all the rest of it, we also Troy was also a seat of the manufacture of really fancy wood stoves. So we have a nice collection of really beautiful Victorian parlor stoves that were made here that we will make part of our exhibits. So we have lots of those kinds of objects that we'll be able to display. I'm hoping to also create a photo gallery of people who worked in some aspect of the industrial life of Troy and of the Burden Ironworks or the Mineola Bell company or whatever. So we're working on drawing those things together. And then we're going to try and create some temporary exhibits so that people coming to the museum aren't going to see the same thing every time they come. And the first temporary exhibit that I'm hoping to produce is on the Marvin Neitzel nursing uniforms. Marvin Neitzel produced nursing uniforms, still does to a certain extent, in Troy for more than 100 years. So I have I've acquired some of they're actually mannequins, but they're scaled mannequins with examples of the salesmen would take these mannequins with them and show them as to demonstrate the nursing uniforms that were being produced at the time. Some of them are like plastic dolls from the 1950s, and one of them is a beautiful mannequin from the 1890s. So I want to sort of display over time the changes that took place in nursing uniforms as nursing itself changed and as the way in which nursing was understood changed. So we're being loaned a number of these pieces to put this exhibit together, and it'll probably be up for this year, and then we'll find other things to exhibit after that. But that's our first sort of temporary exhibit, if you will. So there's lots of different. I mean, every time I turn around, there's something else to think about, and so the good news is there's lots of stuff, and the bad news is there's lots of stuff.
It sounds like you have a really fascinating job with all those things to think about.
Well,
Challenge.
thank you.
And thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been
You're welcome.
great.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Anyone
Susan.
has any further questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'm always happy to respond.
And what is your email?
Jane, can you provide that to people, or?
Yeah, if anyone wants to know, you can just email me, jane@cscvt.org, and I can send you the email. I don't know it off the top of my head.
I just realized I can send you all a message, so I'll do it right now. And then you'll have it if you want it.
Susan, have you always branched out in so many directions at the same time?
Yes.
Yeah, you must thrive on it.
I do, to a certain extent. Sometimes I get a little more ambitious in what I can do as opposed to what's possible. But yeah, I think that I loved teaching. I loved the time that I spent at St. Michael's. And I just see this as an extension of that work. But also now I can use, one of the things I knew in the classroom was that objects and examples and faces and stories were always much more effective as teaching tools. And that's really what I'm doing now.
Okay, you put up your address and I didn't catch it. It went very quickly.
Oh, it doesn't sort of stay in the queue? Sorry.
Okay, I'll go fast this time.
It's still in the chat. It's still in the chat queue. You just,
I think if you look down in the chat queue, you'll find it, but I just posted it again just to.
Oh, okay.
And then if you entirely lose it and you forget and you can't get to Jane, you can always go online and look up the Hudson Mohawk Gateway, and you can get me through our website too.
Okay. But Jane's always out there. Yes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone coming and paying attention.
Okay. Thank you.
thank you so much.
Susan.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jane.
Thank you.